Hey, it is Xennial Gamer, and I am here with my best PC10 team yet. Now, I want to throw this out up front. There is a lot of heavy damage on this team, but the monsters are very slow. The fastest monster on this team is about 170, but they do pretty much all have about 100 crit rate with decent amounts of crit damage and attack. Now, there are some alternatives. I'm running everybody in Violent. If you ran them in Fatal or Rage, you could make up a lot of that damage, but you lose some of the dirt protection and it becomes a slightly slower run. And we'll talk about the different ways you can rune them. But overall, I think this is a team that can be built by late-mid gamers. Now, we're going to go through the runes. We're also going to go through the run and the technique. You guys are probably wondering why I'm sitting here just staring at one partially dead monster on the third wave. I first just want to talk about a couple of the boss's mechanics that we're able to use to make this team work. I also want to warn you, because everybody's going to ask me, can you replace this monster or that monster? I do have another PC10 team that is much more flexible with the monsters that can be used. I'm going to put an info card on screen. But for this team, I tested for several hours on an FRR ticket. I tested a couple of dozen monsters, and I do not believe any of the monsters on this team can be replaced, with the possible exception of replacing Yen for Orochi. Now again, there are other teams, there are lots of other teams you can use where the monsters are more interchangeable. It's just in this one team specifically where I don't see the monsters as replaceable. So in terms of speed tuning, our Joltan is going to go first, and at the speeds I'm running, after the Joltan goes, the boss is going to take a turn. Now, the boss's turn can be one of two things. It can either be the 7 hits that goes directly into one monster, and Joltan being my only dark monster, it means they're all going to go into the Joltan. But the other attack he can do is this Dance of Sword. It attacks all enemies and decreases their attack bars by 30% each with a 30% chance. And when he does Dance of Sword, I do fail on occasion. The overall fail rate of this team seems to be about 2 to 3%. Every one of those fails is the result of Dance of Sword. Now, there is a way to avoid this, and the way that I would avoid this is by putting every monster on will runes and by using HP or defense artifacts to make them a little bit tankier instead of using attack artifacts. The net result of that is that the runs would be slower. I've chosen to take this small fail rate in exchange for getting faster runs. Now, the other really important boss mechanics to understand, one is this left side crystal. It removes all harmful effects granted on the boss. And then we look at the boss's passives. So the boss gets faster throughout the fight, he gets speed buffs, and the faster he is, the less damage he takes, and the more turns he takes, the harder he hits. So basically, the longer the fight is with this boss, the higher your odds of a fail. But this particular passive, the second part of it says that all allies will be increased by up to 50% of their attack bar when they are attacked. What that means is that this left side crystal is going to take a turn before the boss takes a turn. It's going to cleanse the boss. So if you're doing any kind of continuous damage team, which is effectively what we are, you cannot use an AoE monster. That means that you cannot use Tattoo, which was one of the monsters I tested because she's got an AoE. It also means you can't use monsters like Mantora to replace Joltan, at least not in this specific team because of the AoE. Now, the other part of this reverser passive says the boss gains a turn instantly when the boss gets an attack bar decreasing effect. So in a long fight, that's a big part of the problem. You can't use monsters like Lauren that would reduce the boss's attack bar because it's just going to keep taking turns. However, we can use that to our advantage by causing the boss to take a turn before the crystals cleanse it when it has a lot of continuous damage on it. So that brings us to the team that we have here. The Fire Homunculus has 4 continuous damage effects on its skill 1 and 4 more continuous damage effects on its skill 3 plus a brand on its skill 2. Both Rauks have defense break and they have team up. Their team ups are going to basically cause the Fire Homunculus to put continuous damage on the boss. They're going to bring the Joltan for defense breaking the boss, and they're going to turn cycle everybody, and then they're also going to bring the Yen to put slow on the boss. The Yen obviously does a lot of continuous damage as well, but the whole key to this team is that Yen's skill 2 is also going to do an attack bar reduction. So the Yen basically adds a bunch of continuous damage to the boss and then reduces its attack bar, forcing it to eat all of that continuous damage that we got through the whole turn, which means my Yen is actually acting last. So we're going to start off with our Joltan, who adds the first continuous damage. The boss eats that, so you can see Joltan right there effectively just did about 10% damage to the boss because he hit with a continuous damage, and then the boss hit Joltan and took an extra 6,000 damage from the Joltan. Now the Rauks are going to come in next, and you can see right there, we did a big chunk of damage because the boss hasn't gotten its speed buff yet. We landed the defense break and a couple of continuous damage effects. Now the second Rauk goes, we added another continuous damage effect. Now the fire homunculus goes, and we just added a bunch more continuous damage effects. And now the yen goes, and we maxed out the continuous damage effects, and the boss is dead in one turn. Now, that was manual. Obviously, if you're talking about doing it on auto, it doesn't always run exactly that perfect. But when that happens, that's your 33-second run that you can see in that corner right up there. And when it doesn't happen, the average run with this team, as it's currently runed, is probably somewhere in the upper 40-second range. So the overall range is 33 seconds to a minute. The overall average is somewhere maybe in the high 40-second range. Now, in a previous rune configuration I had tested, where basically I had higher quality runes and more damage on this team, the runs were averaging more like 43 seconds, but my goal was to kind of just keep lowering the rune quality and freeing up better runes for PvP, and also just to see exactly how low we could bring the rune quality to see how attainable it was for mid-game level players. So here we are, we're going to do this entire team on auto so you guys can see how it runs through. Now obviously the Joltan going first sets up the defense break, allowing us to kill that first minion on the wave. We got the triple continuous damage here already. This the mid-boss, we just blew right through him. Now, a big part of how long this winds up taking is basically going to come down to how quickly do we clear these waves, and there's some RNG with that because it depends on which monsters the Rauks bring with their team-ups. There's also RNG with the boss as to which monsters the Rauks bring with their team-ups. And then if you guys saw the boss on this level right here, he actually started with what I was talking about with the AoE attack, and those are the runs that are the most dangerous. They tend to take longer because he reduced all my attack bars. And then one of my Rauks in particular is a little bit squishy. Because I've been trying to reduce the overall build qualities, one of the Rauks is a little bit squishier than the other one, and so if the boss lands a crit with that AoE attack and he gets the Rauk low enough, then he may redirect from the Joltan to the Rauk and add a killing blow. That's actually what causes me to fail. So in order to prevent those fails, all I would have to do would be to add will runes to the whole team and boost the HP of one Rauk, and then I would probably be 100% rate on this team. But then I, of course, would be dedicating higher rune quality. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the runes. Let's go ahead and look at the runes and talk about how you would build this team. So again, the Joltan goes first. Now, one other thing I want to mention as I show you these runes, you'll see the Joltan actually has really good stats. This Joltan can be used in PvP. So in the very first like 3 or 4 different PC10 teams I built, the Joltan always had to be like 230 speed on triple will because I was running these really fast teams with Vertihile. And that meant that his HP and defense were too low for me to take him into PvP. One of my goals by making this team slower was actually to get my 2A Joltan back so that I could use him in PvP. As far as the artifacts go, you can see this artifact. The only reason he's using it is obviously the damage received from light. The flat attack isn't benefiting me all that much. But eventually I could enchant that the rest of the way. This artifact does give me some HP. It's not plus 15 yet, and it does give me a little bit of additional damage by reflect and crit damage reduction. Now, the other thing you'll notice is the 87 crit rate. Does he need that? No. He really doesn't. When I ran the build, I noticed that I was able to give him a high crit rate build, and because he scales off of HP, it means he actually does some respectable damage in this build. 100% not necessary. Joltan, basically his entire role is to tank the boss, defense break, and add some continuous damage. The rest of it is all just kind of bonus, so if you wanted to do this set without any of that crit rate, you'd be totally fine. The one thing you do want to make sure is that he's got at least 24 accuracy. And then in terms of speed, you can see that I'm actually running him at 166. So this is the Rauk, and as you can see, this one has low defense, high HP. I would actually prefer to switch that over a little bit. Now the accuracy for PC10 that you need is 24 accuracy. So you see the Rauk is 2% low, but I'll tell you I actually have accuracy runes on my fire homunculus. So you can see the Rauk has 100 crit rate. Does he need 100 crit rate? Kind of yes, kind of no. So basically, the 100 crit rate is for the waves. It's not going to make as much of a difference on the boss. Obviously, the Rauks are our primary damage dealers on the waves, not because necessarily they hit so much harder than Yen or Fire Homunculus, but because of their passive that allows them to keep taking more and more turns. and then because of the team-ups and just the general turn-cycling nature of Rauks. Now, you'll also see that everybody except Joltan is going to be on Violent Runes in this team. You don't specifically have to have Violent Runes. It's going to make your runs faster. But if you could match these stats in Fatal, the team would probably be just fine. Because obviously when I run this enough, sometimes I just go a run with no procs and I still beat it. It's just maybe a little bit slower. So if you could match these stats using Fatal, or maybe have a little less attack and more crit damage and rage, you're probably totally okay. So lower crit rate you're going to be able to get away with. It just means slower runs. Now, as far as the artifacts on this Rauk, the fire artifact is generally just garbage. Like, none of this really affects this Rauk in this dungeon at all, because I'm not using an attack buff. He's a single target hitter, so the additional damage by percentage of attack and HP, none of that stuff really helps me much at all. He's wearing it just because of the plus 100 attack, and also because he does get a little benefit from this in Steel Fortress. Now, this artifact actually fits the Rauk really well. Obviously, you can see 11% crit damage on skill 1, 7 on skill 2 is really nice. The other two subs in there, they're not doing so much for me, but still, it's a couple of really nice bonuses to crit damage. The HP doesn't obviously benefit Rauk quite as much, and so the point I'm really trying to make here is that they've got artifacts. The artifacts are decent, but they're not amazing. So as you're building your dungeon teams, keep that in mind. You put on some artifacts and it helps you, and it doesn't have to be like the best artifact designed for that monster ever. At least not at the start. You can always upgrade it later. Now, here's the second Rauk. You're going to see the stats are virtually identical, except he's got 100 more defense and 3,000 less HP. So he's just generally a little bit squishier, but the overall damage levels are about the same. The 18 accuracy, again, I have accuracy runes on the Fire Homunculus, so we crossed that 24 threshold. Now, the Fire Artifact, this one is, once again, not really a great fit for him, but the one big thing is I've got that 14% damage reduction from Light. It really helps me on this particular dungeon, and that's why the other Rauk is the one that's taking more damage, and ultimately, sometimes the other Rauk dies, which is what causes the fails. And then this, once again, the artifact's okay. I mean, we've got a little extra damage dealt by attacking together and a little extra crit damage on the team up. No benefit at all from the revival or the attack increasing, but it's just giving me some extra stats and just a little bit of extra benefit. Now, acting fourth is going to be the Fire Homunculus. Once again, we're in violent accuracy in this case. The stats are nearly identical to the Rauks again. Once again, if you can't make all these stats in Violent, then you're fine to go ahead and just make them in Fatal or in Rage. But what I will tell you is, of all the monsters, the one you want on Violent the most is your Homunculus because of the skill 1, because he's adding all this continuous damage every time he procs. And ultimately, it's a continuous damage team, so the more continuous damage we put on the boss, the faster we kill him. So if you can only put one in Violent, put the Homunculus in Violent, and if you have to lower somebody's stats significantly, lower his stats. He does actually do a lot of damage, but his damage is not what we're relying on him for. The Rauk's damage is what's helping us clear the waves. The Fire Homunculus continuous damage is what's helping us clear the boss. So maybe you can't make 100 crit rate with him. Make him lower crit rate, make him a little bit lower attack, but try to keep him on the Violent if you can. Okay, as far as artifacts, once again, now this artifact actually does synergize a little bit because he gets 4 hits, so the 78% of speed, that's a pretty decent one. The damage received from Light, minus 1%, is not really making a lot of difference. So it synergizes a little bit, but it's not great. Now, this artifact, when I had the Water Homunculus, this was, like, freaking amazing. This is probably my best overall artifact. Legitimately, like, probably my best overall artifact. It's an awesome artifact. I don't know if it really makes as much sense on the Fire Homunculus right now. Yeah, anyway, but this was an absolutely amazing artifact for Water Homunculus. In the meantime, it is still pretty nice on the Fire Homunculus as well, I'm not going to lie. And then acting last at a whopping 159 speed is the Yen. Now, I will tell you, this is the bare minimum speed you can have for this dungeon. Boss's combat speed is 175. That means the Yen's combat speed is exactly 175. You can see she's a little bit tankier than the Rauks are. She's actually got a little less crit damage than they do. About the same attack again, a little less crit damage, a little bit tankier, and that's partly because of the artifacts. So we get 100 defense from this wind artifact. We're also getting some additional damage on light. She is not actually a multi-hitter on her skill 1, even though it seems like it, but she procs a lot. She's a multi-hitter on skill 2, so she's benefiting from the damage by speed. Now the attack artifact, once again, we've got more HP. Now the damage dealt by attacking together does kind of work in this team, and the crit damage on skill 1 works in this team, but overall, once again, it's not like, as far as the entire team goes, I only have one really amazing artifact on it, which is the one on the fire homunculus. Now, as I said at the start, unfortunately, I really don't believe that for this particular team, any of these monsters are replaceable. The one possible exception would be to replace Yen for another monster that did something similar. Now, I've got to throw this out there. A monster like Yaku does not actually do something similar, because although Yaku adds a lot of continuous damage, he doesn't detonate the boss with an attack bar reduction. And so there is the possibility that the boss will wind up getting cleansed by the tower. Yaku does some really nice stuff because he's got continuous damage and a lot of, he's got, his skill 3 has a chance to ignore defense in addition to the continuous damage. So he's a really good monster. For this boss in other teams, he's just not necessarily great for the boss in this team. Now, the one monster I can think of that might really fit well here would be Orochi. So the thing with Orochi is he can do up to 6 continuous damage. He can detonate the boss with his skill 2, but they're different skills. So what'll happen is he's either going to add a lot of continuous damage or detonate the boss, but he's not going to do both unless it just happens to be on a violent proc. Now, the other thing about Orochi is that his leader skill is going to be 30% speed by wind, which is going to make it really difficult to speed tune because you need him to act last. So he'd need to be like 120 speed if you use his leader skill. And none of the other monsters on this team have a leader skill. So if you were to switch out Yen for Orochi, you wind up with no leader skill and kind of a difficult speed tuning task by needing to make that Orochi super slow. Yeah, 43-second run. And again, this is about what you'll see from this team. It gets as low as 33 seconds. Very, very, very rarely does it get up around a minute, but generally it goes between 43 and 55, between 33 and 55 seconds. That's the overall average of this team. About 97, 98% success rate in the runes I have right now. We'll call it 97, be conservative. If I were to add a little bit more tankiness or some better artifacts to the Rauk that's getting beat up, and if I added will runes to everybody, I think this team would be really, really close to 100%, if not completely 100%. And then in addition, I think those will runes would probably speed if I added the will runes without giving up damage, I also think that would speed the runs up, the average time up quite a bit. It wouldn't speed the top times up, obviously that's just a perfect run, but what it would do is all those runs where the boss is starting with its AoE attack by having the will runes and not losing attack bar, those runs would get sped up by about 10 seconds, raising the overall average. So that's going to be it for today's video, guys. As always, I hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it useful, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.